Former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb worked with Peter Marks, and he did weigh in on his departure earlier today.
It's equally profound to Peter Marks' contributions on vaccine approvals, and the renaissance that we've seen in new vaccines over the last really 2 decades was his impact on cell and gene therapy. He presided over the modern creation of that field. Peter was working on a lot of policies that were going to help expedite these products to the market and make the process for development far more efficient. I think for a lot of innovators today, they're very worried about what the status is of that review program at FDA now that Peter has left, and there's going to be a lot of departures behind Peter.
So our next guest is here to explain why this is all causing such a sell-off for biotech stocks. Let's bring in Paul Matteis. He's head of biotech research at Stifel. And it's a tough day for the space, Paul. So what's your advice for investors here? What should they make of it?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here, but it's also a little bit of a bummer to be here. And it's a tough mood and with the investors I'm talking to today. I mean, I think the advice is that in navigating this uncertainty, you're just going to have to ultimately be more selective at the type of stocks you buy and the type of risk you take on. Because if you take a step back here, biotech investors who look at developmental stage companies, and this goes far beyond the vaccine space, right? They have to grapple with scientific risk, clinical trial risk, commercial risk, patent risk, competition risk. And the FDA over the past 5 or so years has been fairly predictable, right? If anything, a tailwind for the space. And even outside of vaccines, if you look at companies developing things for, rare disease or other areas where you can look at biomarkers of approval, the FDA has been a huge tailwind because they've been working on kind of clearing red tape, accelerating things. And I think now people just have to deal with unpredictability. There's a practical consequence short term where if we see more departures, and we already saw the head of CDER leave, we could see delays in drug approvals. But then over the midterm, when we think about groups of companies that have agreements with the FDA on a certain path to getting a drug to market, I think investors now have to reevaluate some of these and wonder, does that path still stand? So it's not that biotech broadly becomes unownable, but I think now investors, are going to look more towards commercial stage companies or companies whose growth prospects are not contingent upon the FDA behaving the way it's been in the past couple of years.
So just to understand, the concern for vaccine stocks is that the agency might now be, how would you phrase it? That they're going to be less willing to approve vaccines?
I mean, it's a great question, right? So I think what's important here is that Peter Marks ran CBER, right, which goes far beyond vaccines. It covers gene therapies, gene editing, and his influence on CBER also permeated through the whole FDA when you even think about CDER, right, your typical pill. But for vaccines specifically, right, I mean, I think there's certainly a question around the risk tolerance for vaccines, safety tolerance, the hurdles for approval, how things could be labeled. But again, when we see the XBI trading off like this, it far transcends vaccines. I mean, vaccine stocks are a very, very small portion of the innovation that's going on in biotech. I think the concern with investors is that Dr. Marks accelerated innovation in areas like rare disease, in areas like oncology. And so, I think when you just take a step back here, it makes the FDA broadly unpredictable, again, far beyond vaccines. The bull case on the excuse me, please go ahead.
Go ahead, and maybe you were just about to answer this next question, but you said kind of where the market is looking for is for like the cleanest growth stories, commercial stories, companies that are mostly de-risked. Can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, totally. So I think, a lot of stocks in biotech, right, are in phase 1 stage testing, phase 2 stage testing, and they might have some sort of agreement with the FDA where they can look at a clinical measure or a biological measure to get a drug approved. A lot of companies in the past few years have benefited from greater flexibility at the FDA with things like breakthrough therapy designation, the START program that Peter Marks started. Yeah, these are all things far beyond the vaccine space, right? And I think that's why this is so important. So if you're an investor in this space now, the question you have to ask yourself is, do you really want to take on FDA risk? Do you really want to take on risk that you get everything right, the science right, the clinical trial right, but then the drug might not get approved? And I don't want to be hyperbolic. There's a positive case to be made here that maybe a lot doesn't change, right? Maybe Dr. McCary, who's viewed as a credible and great pick for commissioner, could put people into place in CDER and CBER that continue this trend we've seen. But if you're an investor, I think the argument short term is to be more selective. Look at companies who are not reliant on a predictable FDA for their stocks to go up. And so we're seeing certain companies relatively outperform today, like a Vertex, like an Alnylam, companies like that where the stock setup is more contingent upon a successful commercial launch and less dependent on the agency.